It's time for the Cyber Executive Podcast, where we will talk with the top industry experts about risk, technology, and leadership. I am your host, Marc Ashworth, and today I have the pleasure of having Joe Sullivan of Joe Sullivan Security Consulting with me here today. Joe, thank you very much for being here as a guest on the latest episode of the Cyber Executive Podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, I'm so excited about this. I've read up a lot about you and everything, and I've been on a few webinars where you've spoken in the past and everything. So I think this would be great, and I know you're doing a lot of things around consulting and advising and stuff now, especially I believe in the startup and small business and other markets. So I just kind of wanted to kick it off here and just say, as you're talking to these organizations, security and especially complexity, can be the enemy. So what are a few foundational security items that you should not be overlooking whenever you're, trying to start these new programs up?
Yeah, that's a really good starting point. When you come into a new environment, the temptation is to just use a framework and go methodically through it. And I think you should do that because it makes sure, that gives you the discipline to kind of look under all the different corners. But one of the lessons I've learned over the years is that you often hear the good ideas at the bad times. And what that means is it's during a crisis moment or while you're doing an investigation or something like that you notice, if we just had this, it would have taken 3 hours less to get to the bottom of this situation. And so I probably more than a decade ago, I started, when we were all in the office, anytime there was an incident or kind of like a brainstorming session, I just had this big whiteboard and I always would just table for later those insights that come up during those moments because you got to capture those things to get back to them. This isn't a formal risk register, but it's the good idea list, and I think you always have to have that good idea list that you're building out, and because the frameworks get you at a surface level. It's during those incidents and situations that you're going a lot deeper in a particular area. The second insight that I think is really important to remember from the start is that everything breaks when you stop paying attention to it. And you don't notice that it's broken until you get to a situation in which you needed it. So a good example is you go back to incidents, you set up all this logging and you assume that your logging pipelines are flowing and everything's going into your detection platform. And then you have an incident and then you realize that 3 of your logging pipelines broke 3 months ago, but you didn't have anything set up to alert you or your team that it stopped working. So whenever I kind of set up something new, you like to choose products that are set it and forget it, but I don't think you should just set it and forget it. You should also set up some automation so that you get alerts, so that the defenses that you think that you have and the other controls that you think you have are actually in place. So those are two things that I don't think are in the standard playbook, but that I try and capture.
Yeah, that's great tips. And one thing I have my teams do is take a moment and step back from the day-to-day and look at the processes, do that critical thinking of where in our environment can we make improvements on? Because we have to constantly be evolving, just like IT should and, the organization should. We have to keep that in the group. And those items, as you're coming across of it, just add that to the to-do list. And, just where we're documenting that some spot, like you mentioned, and just get those items down because, something you're going to turn around and start talking to somebody and you're going to forget about it, right? So very good tip. So I know also that in, part of those fundamentals is around identity and, you have the basics around MFA and that sort of stuff. And it's a critical component. For some reason, it seems like startups or small companies just overlook it too much, whether it's remote access or whatever it might be, and they're not building identity and security basics in there. So what do you recommend for identity and maturing the security around it in an organization?
Well, I agree with you Identity is really important. In fact, I think it's the most important thing. And so whenever I go into a company, I start, my questions start with, okay, let's talk about where we are on identity. And like I'm engaged in a couple of big public companies right now, and it's still the starting question. It doesn't matter if you're small or large. There are always gaps in identity that need to be addressed. And I think it's the most important area because every single security incident involves some abuse of insider privileges, almost everyone, right? I see these vendors put out these stats that say 90% of all breaches start with an identity compromise. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think close to 100% of compromises involve some abuse of identity. Like if they somehow magically got through your firewall, they still, once you're inside and they're in one of your servers, the next thing that the attacker always does is go to figure out who has the privileges account and how do I take it over, because you need that privileged access to move laterally inside any organization once you're in. So, and I've seen sometimes when I've done red teams or other incidents, oftentimes it's the insider threat tooling that's looking at lateral movement of employees inside that catches the outsider. And that's just another validation for me. So I always start with identity. And I think small companies in particular have a hard time getting the identity momentum because single sign-on is not easy to roll out. I've had the great pleasure of rolling out single sign-on at 3 different companies in the last 2 years. And the reason the company hadn't rolled it out before was because they didn't have dedicated security people, or if they did, it seemed like too big a lift for them to try and roll it out. And there's so much cost associated with rolling out single sign-on that you don't appreciate until you implement it at a small company. The identity providers, they built their products to work for large enterprises, and they're not actually chasing the small business market. So the products aren't tailored for the small market, and they're not priced well for the small market. And they're not easy to deploy. Like moving every single one of your SaaS apps behind an identity provider is a slog. A lot of those apps, you've got to use SCIM, you got to jump through lots of hoops to get them to work, and sometimes they can't work. Like one of the companies I'm working with right now, I won't say the name of the software product, but it's a CAD product that's been around for a long time. And it was built to work on your desktop. And so trying to figure out how to get single sign, how do you get that behind your single sign-on provider? It's really hard to do, but you need to do it because the CAD designs in there are the most sensitive IP of the company.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in the startup world or in the small businesses and stuff, security is more of an afterthought. And because there's such a rush to market to get, that first product out, or to, just keep things going, or like you said, small staff that doesn't have the expertise. But yeah, protecting, that intellectual property that you're putting so much time and sweat equity into it to keep that protected, some of the basics there, because someone's going to get in there and take it right away. As soon as they can, that's how some are, making their living, is just stealing that stuff. And so, with security and startups and, being an afterthought, like I kind of mentioned, what do you recommend in these environments? And you kind of hit on a few points off of it, but, to deal with that to where it's not an afterthought, to where you're looking at it of, oh my goodness, we should have done this, or we knew we needed to do this and we didn't do it, and now it's too late.
Yeah, I think the part of it is, if you're a small business and you look at the security frameworks, it's just a really long laundry list of things to get done. And
it's overwhelming.
Yeah. And you don't know where to start, and you don't know which one is first. So stepping back, I would say, yes, I do notice that small businesses really struggle with this. I think that so I'm based in Silicon Valley and Palo Alto, and I do a lot of projects with startups. I have seen a really promising trend in the last year or two, which is startup founders caring about security. It's a little bit of a shock, but it's a pleasant shock for me that a lot of the projects that I'm being brought in on right now are companies where, well, in one case, I'm starting a project I just started this week with a company that's 10 employees, but they just got funding and they're expecting that they're going to have 50 employees by the end of the year. And that CEO understands, all right, we're doing, he has big dreams. And so he should have good security so that those dreams don't get stolen. And he's willing to invest in it as part of, that funding round. It's the small business that doesn't get a venture capital firm coming and dropping millions of dollars on them that can't think this way about security. Those are the ones that are really struggling. And it's on all of us in the industry to do a better job of boiling down like the critical stuff. And so I try and do that. And, in my view, I want to see those smaller companies commit to, basically like just 2 or 3 things. I think if you get single sign-on with multi-factor authentication, company-issued machines with, device management policies and a detection engine on the endpoint, you've made a lot of progress. We shouldn't be telling a company that has no security team, you need to have, you need to build a SIM and you should be writing your own detection rules. We should find for them, good managed security providers that can help them, but who won't overwhelm them.
Yeah, because a SIM, especially for a small company, is a large investment, and and the prices of them are not going down any. They can just continue to get more and more expensive, and especially as they're becoming more and more cloud-based and the usage and everything too. So, a third party, is a good solution to help and offset some of that. One of the things that a lot of organizations are doing, they're evaluating AI. It's all the rage right now. So what sort of considerations should organizations have when considering AI and first bringing that into their environment?
Yeah, I've heard some security people say, "Oh, I'm not allowing AI in my company," and I'd say your head's in the sand. It's already happening inside your company, whether you like it or not, because the kids who graduated from college last year, they're using it, whether you have a policy against it or not. And so, to me, when I think about AI, step one is visibility. You gotta understand how it's being used inside the company before you can get involved in good decision. So it doesn't start with banning it. It starts with an open dialogue with all the different teams inside the company about like who's using AI, who's thinking about using AI, what uses are there, and then building some policies. Like you got to have a debate internally. Like the security leader cannot say we're not doing AI because the company's going to do AI. If you're not if your company's not doing AI or thinking about doing AI, something's broken at the company, right? Because your competitors are all going to use AI and it's going to help them. And so you got to be using AI. And the security leader needs to stand up and say, hey, I want to help us use AI responsibly. And so having the courage to stand up and have that conversation and accept that you're going to be inviting some risks by doing AI, but the company's going to do it either way. So step one, visibility. Step two, developing a policy. And then, there are a bunch of AI security products popping up in the market over the last year and a half. And the good thing is that they're coming at the problem from different angles and they're thinking about different risks. The bad thing is that they're coming at it from different angles and thinking about different risks. So you got to do your homework and you got to think about but your AI deployment is where you start. If it's customer facing, that's like building a website and putting it out for the public. You better make sure the front end is secure. And you need to think about if you're going to open up your AI, if it's a prompt, chatbot thing that consumers can, and anyone in the world can interact with, your risk level is very different than if you're rolling out, an LLM inside for some team to use inside the company to get insights in a business area. So the risk is going to be very different in the different implementations.
Are you seeing more companies that's kind of rolling their own AI or using like an open source and doing that internally, or just interfacing with the co-pilots, the Gemini and Bards and those products that's out there?
I'm surprised at how much people are quote unquote rolling their own. It's happening a lot right now in more places. I expect it in the big companies that call themselves tech companies. Like they could be a financial institution and call themselves a tech company. They have large engineering teams. Lots of companies have large engineering teams now, and they're doing things with data. They're all looking at, should we build something specialized? Because they don't need they don't need to use an LLM that has processed every word on the internet. They want an LLM that's processed their proprietary data, and so I think that the risks are significant when you start bringing your own building your own models, and you're going to have I think dedicated security engineers who really understand and are focused on learning in this area.
Mm-hmm. So, with the topic of securing AI, what's some recommendations that you have for doing that? We kind of talked about the platforms and stuff, but
yeah, I think about it. I think about it from like a traditional security practitioner lens. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of the AI companies are getting wrong, is that they're trying to create and describe things as wholly new categories. We all like analogies because it helps us understand, new things. And with the AI, I think the risks are, well, the number one risk from a security leader standpoint is that our job is to protect a bunch of data that's inside the company. It might be IP, it might be personal information, it might be something else, but the point is it's our job to keep that data from getting in the wrong hands at the end of the day. It's that simple. And we have to think about that with the AI. Now, there are a lot of AI security products that are focused on that. And, they're analogizing themselves to DLP or role-based access control. The role-based access control example is, an employee goes into the corporation throws all their internal data in an LLM, and then an employee goes in and says, when are the layoffs coming? And if, the dialogue between the head of HR and the CEO is somehow in there, then they get the answer. And that's really happened in at least one case that I've heard of. So you got to be careful. You got to be thinking through, does everybody in the company need access to everything that we fed into the model? The DLP example is, you might have a sensitive category of data inside the company that should not be moved. Maybe people in customer support need to have access to my account, but the rest of the company doesn't need to have access, and it might even be considered a data breach if other company employees who are over in sales had access to it. And somebody in sales might want to get access to it if, like at some of the companies I worked at, like at Facebook, we had to fire employees who wanted to go look up their ex-girlfriend or ex-boyfriend or ex-spouse. You have to deal with those types of risks, and so you got to put barriers in place. And then there's also the incentive people have to grab some sensitive internal data and take it out. And if they're leaving the company, or they want to support a competitor, or they just want to take the company down. Mm-hmm. So you think about it from a DLP standpoint. The one area that I think is kind of a new concept is the prompt injection attack. For me, the analogy I've made in prompt injection. So what a prompt injection attack is at a high level is, you have the chat bot and you put in a query, a prompt that tricks the LLM into spitting out some information that you didn't want that it shouldn't spit out, or it tricks the LLM into doing something that you didn't want it to do. Generally speaking, so my analogy for prompt injection is it's like an application security issue. The LLM is it's a set of code, and a prompt is almost like an input, and we have to think about and worry about. And when you open up your chatbot to the public, you're basically giving the whole world the ability to kind of almost code in your code base, and so you gotta be worried about that too. Obviously, if the chatbot's only open internally, a little less worrisome, unless you're thinking about insider threat.
Yeah, and that's where, as you mentioned, DLP kind of comes in and trying to not only control what is put into the AI, but then also the outputs from that and what happens to that. So around DLP itself, what sort of things are you seeing either in the market or what companies are doing uh, with DLP to secure AI?
Yeah, I just saw a really awesome implementation of DLP in the AI context. Um, I was partnering with the CISO of a public company, and we were looking at DLP products, and we were talking through a particular issue. There are a lot of companies that have a bunch of sensitive data that they don't want to get into the LLM. It might be that because they do business with the United States government, say, there's like ITAR data, or there's a million different categories of data that, or even if in the commercial context, you might have a vendor who's a partner and they expose certain data to you and they put very specific limits on it. And so like, they're going to want to say, and I would think about this if it was a company that licensed data, or shared it with partners, I would want in my contract, you can't take our data and put it in your LLM, right? And so one thing companies have been doing is basically saying, okay, the employees who have access to that data, we can't. How do we stop them from putting it in an LLM? How do if the employee has access to the data, you start with the policy, obviously, but we all know
around that. Yeah,
you need to have some controls too, and that's an interesting application of DLP that I've seen work, where you could basically say, look, if you could make sure that the data that's in this data warehouse does not end up in the LLM, like if the DLP product is good enough that you can catch the employee, like the employee's not doing anything malicious there. It's not like they're taking it and putting it in a Dropbox folder that's their personal Dropbox folder. They're taking it to do their job, and they just forgot or don't know that they're not supposed to take that data and put it in the LLM. You can enforce policy using your DLP that way.
Yeah, or they accidentally put too much of the data in. Maybe they were trying to do certain columns and they inadvertently did Control A and got all of it, and then they dump all of it in by accident, and now it's all in there. So it could be accidental just as much as anything else. So
yep.
Many third parties are incorporating AI into their platforms, and they're doing it at different levels, right? So they're either existing products, and now they're getting on the AI bandwagon and doing that. So when you're evaluating these third parties and their solutions off of that, what sort of recommendations or tips do you have, to engage with those third parties on their AI and how they're utilizing it in their platforms?
Yeah. Well, stepping back, I think you need to assume that every one of your vendors is going to be using AI.
Yeah.
To my earlier points on like your business is going to fall behind if it's not, and their business is going to fall behind. So of course they're using AI, even if they don't tell you they are. So that means we need to pull out our list of all of our vendors, and we kind of need to go through them yet again and do an extra risk assessment for third-party risk. If they have access to your sensitive data, you might need to update your contract terms with them, and you definitely need to send them some questions about what they're doing around AI, and then you got to get a sense of what's actually happening. You may want to pull back what data you're sharing. You may want to put some different contractual terms in place, and you may want to put some kind of detection in to make sure that they don't abuse it.
Yeah. Is there any good guidelines that you have seen to help guide companies on, what type of questions to ask those third parties, and, whether it's an existing vendor or a new vendor that you're looking at?
Yeah, that's a good question. In the past, I've used some of the standard vendor questionnaires or had my teams use them, but I haven't gone back and looked to see if they've updated them. I have to imagine that they have the SIGs and the Vendor Security Alliance and all those groups that have put together those questionnaires in the past. As much as we hate questionnaires, we sometimes do still need to use them as part of our discovery process.
Yeah, especially with the more and more regulator scrutiny around third parties and even fourth parties for that matter. And even if you don't have the regulators asking that, it should be just part of your due diligence that you're doing it, when you're bringing on a new vendor and talking to them. And like you said, having those conversations retro to for existing ones on what they're doing with it and staying in touch with those organizations. So
yeah, 100%.
So just kind of change things up here a little bit. All my guests, I asked the same three questions just to get their take and something a little fun to do. So what is something that companies could be doing better? And it could be the security industry in itself, or just companies that you see and speak to that should be doing something better than what they're currently doing.
Yeah, well, I think we need to be more transparent about how difficult security is and not just project to the world, yeah, we got it covered. The world's figured it out. Security's hard. The never-ending stories about data breaches and security incidents, they never stop. And it's because security's hard. And part of it is being transparent about how hard it is. But the second part of it is we've always talked about public-private partnerships, but I don't think anybody believes we've figured it out and are doing it well. The reality of, like, when we step back, I used to be a federal prosecutor, and I got into cyber doing that, and so I was the first full-time federal cybercrime prosecutor in the country back in the turn of the century. And it was interesting. It was really hard for the government to get used to the internet, because before the internet, the government had everything it needed to do to protect people. Mm-hmm. In the physical world, the government has everything it needs. In the internet, the vast majority of what the government needs to do a good job is in the hands of the private sector. Mm-hmm. I had a good conversation with a guy who recently retired from the NSA, and he said, we were talking about this topic, and he said, it's really tough because in the government, we know that we can't go to the private sector and just say, give us all the data and we'll take care of it. The public doesn't want Google and Facebook to give all their data to the federal government. Mm-hmm. But the public still wants Facebook, Google, and the federal government to figure out how to secure the people. And so to me, this is we're never going to be great at protecting people until we get better at the public-private partnership stuff. And, for most of us in our day jobs, like, we don't really think about and engage with the government on cybersecurity. Like, I do a bunch of projects inside companies, and it's never really part of the core project plan to build a partnership with the government, but it needs to be as the organizations mature.
Yeah, CISA's done a good job with some various outreach, and we had a previous episode with Raphael Constantine, who is our local president of the St. Louis InfraGard, so the InfraGard chapter. So we had a nice discussion about that on, finding your local chapter of that to engage and build that relationship with the government, because it's a lot better doing it now when it's on a casual term versus having to have that conversation, either them knocking on the door and letting you have a problem, or you having to reach out to them and say we have a problem. So, it's a good source to do in your local area, and to reach out to the local InfraGard chapter. And there's 70 of them, I think, throughout the country. So,
yeah, and I think people will find that the government does have a lot of decent resources that can help in different contexts, not just like on your worst day.
Yeah, the threat intelligence that you get off of there, and things that you might not necessarily see right away in the press, you'll get that information sooner, to where you can work with that and start reacting to that. And it's a lot better having it sooner than when it's too late, and especially around whether it's a particular vulnerability that they're working against or exploiting or something else. So.
Yeah, a good example of that was the FBI, I thought, really pushed out some concrete, important information on the North Korean IT worker threat.
Hmm.
Uh, like, to me, it was a fascinating topic because it was a threat that was very different from one that we talk about regularly. And it was a threat that kind of threads the edges between our cybersecurity team and our physical security team. You know, cybersecurity team doesn't often get involved in the onboarding of new employees and the screening of them and stuff like that. But the cybersecurity team does have a responsibility once that person starts to make sure that they're not doing malicious things. And it's astonishing how many American companies have hired North Korean IT workers since the pandemic started, really. And I've personally worked with companies remediate where we caught one and had to remediate the situation. And I've talked to a bunch of other companies that have had to deal with it. And so, like, as a security leader, you think you're up on all the threats, and then something new comes around the corner. And
Yeah.
and so it's, it was good that the FBI really didn't just once but multiple times put out messaging about explaining this situation. And then some companies like CrowdStrike and others started sharing specific threat intelligence information, and so it's that transparency and communication of, if one company has a problem with a new type of issue, if they start talking about it, we can all defend against it. If they bury it, nobody knows.
Yeah, and KnowBe4 had some really good write-ups because they got caught in that, and so they told their story, and so check that out if you haven't seen that.
Yep.
So
that's a good example.
So what is something that you're tired of hearing about in the industry?
I'm tired of hearing about my case.
I wasn't going to bring it up, so
right? Thank you for that. No, I get invited to talk about it all the time, and
yeah.
In the beginning, I was uncomfortable talking about it because it's hard to talk about your shortcomings, and then I got used to talking about it, and I do think there are important underlying issues around getting the public and private sector working on a healthy direction, make sure executives aren't held to task for things that were beyond their control, lots of different things like that, but. The sub part of it that I think I'm sick of hearing in particular is about D&O insurance. Like I hear so many people saying, "Oh, the solution to all of that stuff is get D&O insurance." And I'm like, I'm sick of hearing that because it's the wrong answer. It's a much more complicated situation. What the security leader needs is a commitment to do the right thing at the leadership level and indemnity. D&O insurance is the backstop to indemnity. That's just like the insurance that will cover the policy. But the policy, is security leaders should be fully indemnified to the maximum extent of the law.
Yeah, I agree. So finally, what is a particular trend in technology or security that you're following and something that we may consider?
You know what? I am fascinated by what's going on right now in the world of robotics. Robotics is going to change all of our work so much in cybersecurity because, number one, we're all going to have to develop an expertise in OT, not just IT, because these robotic machines are different. It's not a Windows machine or a MacBook. It's a completely different. Every one of them is different. But even more than the OT aspects, it's the data collection aspects. When I think about why is it so expensive to do AI right now? It's because they're modeling against all the data in all the data warehouses. But you know what's happening where AI is? So the reason why robotics is going faster now than ever is because we're like, great, we can put AI in the robot. And to do that, the AI needs way more data. I think that AI right now is two-dimensional. And 99% of what's in all of the data warehouses and all the data centers on the planet is two-dimensional data. I mean, it's documents, it's photos, it's videos, it's stuff that we can render on the screen of our computer. But why is Meta subsidizing those glasses? And why does every Tesla have more cameras than they need, and they're collecting all that data and sending it back to data warehouses? Because the AI needs to train on three-dimensional data of the world. Now, there's a hype around all these AI data centers and like a debate about whether there's too much investment in it. And I don't think there's too much investment in it, because I believe that in 5 years, there's going to be 5 times as much data stored. It's not going to be the same data that's already in the data centers. It's going to be the three-dimensional stuff. If I want a robot to be a waiter or a waitress in a restaurant, what does the robot need to know? Think about all the little things that a waiter knows about, like I approach from the right shoulder and I can read the table to figure out if they're done with their plates or not. There's a lot that happens before judgment, and if you put that in AI, it needs to have the data, which means that real human waiters are going to have to wear glasses that collect that data, and then the model, there's just going to be so much that's going to happen in order for robotics to meet its potential. And if, when I talk about it, I get excited because it's great from a robotics are going to be good for our life. But when I put on my security leader hat, I'm like, oh crap, that's a lot more data, and that's a lot more AI safety risk that comes from allowing robots to function in the 3D world. And so I think our job is just we're going to have more stuff to secure, and it's going to be in the 3D world more than it ever has been.
Yeah, and the most important thing when training a waiter robot is to make sure to go up and ask how they're doing when they just put food in their mouth. So that's that's a good sign of a good waiter or waitress, right? So
exactly.
Well, Joe, thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate you being on the podcast and giving your insights. It was definitely very informative, and hope to have more conversations with you.
Awesome. Thanks for having me on.
And for everyone else, thanks for being part of the cyber executive community today. We explored key security concepts for startups, small businesses, AI security. We hope you found value in the discussion. If you did, please subscribe and leave a review. It helps others discover our content. We'll be here next week with another episode. Until then, hope you'll join us at that time. Thank you.